Well, he's right. I have a very broad profile, but today I want to talk about the current project that I'm working on, which deals with animal reintroduction in Norway and Sweden broadly. And there's two species that I work on at the moment, which is beaver and muskox. And so this paper is about the muskox portion of that, naturalized national identities, migrant muskox in northern nature. I'd of course be happy to answer any questions you have about the rest of my profile afterwards. So in the realm of historical studies, human migrations, whether they're forced or deliberately chosen, are a pretty standard area of inquiry now. You have scholarship in journals like International Migration or Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which brings human migration and its consequences to the fore, particularly to question and reflect on international immigration policy. Social scientists, including demographers and economists, sociologists, and political scientists, along with social and political historians, have been involved in this field. So when you see a title of a book like Migration in World History, you implicitly assume that it's on human migration. Environmental migration as a concept is in fact has been proposed, but it's limited to human migration due to environmental change or to stress events. On the other hand, animal migrations, whether through the choice of the individual animals or forced upon them, has been relegated to the realm of the natural sciences, where animal movements are modeled or predicted. Within the biological sciences, migration is only understood as an adaptation to resources leading to mobile animal populations. But today, I want to offer a humanistic inquiry of animal migration as a possible and fruitful way of understanding how human and animal histories intersect. Rather than think about animal migration only in the biological sense, I want to apply an approach to migration that encompasses movement over political borders, opening up the animal movements like translocations of individuals which are captured in the wild and then taken to another location for release, as an object of migration inquiry, like a forced migration. A migration approach also allows a focus on the particular animals, the particular individuals moving or being moved, which avoids the trap of studying movement only on the level of an entire species, which actually can obfuscate what happens to the individual. In this way, a migration approach might give agency to animals which choose to move over human-made political boundaries, borders which they neither know nor care about. These immigrant animals are moving to greener pastures to survive, just as humans migrate for both push and pull reasons. Similar to human immigrants, animal immigrants can be met with both open arms or resistance. And while there is historical research on the classification of animal species as native or non-native, exotic or alien, the inquiry, as far as I know, has not framed this story as one analogous to a human migration. Now, the animal I'm talking about, the muskox, is probably the worst named animal on the planet. It has neither musk nor is it an ox. It's a ruminant in the same family as sheep and goats, although its propensity to charge using its solid, thick horns has led to its association with oxen. And it does have a strong smell, which reminded the earlier explorers of musk deer. Thus it gets the name musk ox, when it has neither of those things. It has a thick coat of wool, which is particularly warm and water resistant, and it's shed naturally in the summertime, and you can see some of the thick wool of this one that I saw this summer coming off, the top wool on the top. Muskoxen inhabit the Arctic and subarctic tundra, eating grasses, lichens, mosses, and other plants. They're generally sedentary during the winter months because they conserve energy and they dig for foliage under shallow snow. Fossil evidence shows that during the Pleistocene, which ends about 11,000 years ago, their range was circumpolar, including Scandinavia. In the 19th century, though, muskox populations were restricted to Arctic Canada and Greenland. But the limited geographical spread of Muskoxen was radically to change in the course of the 20th century, as individuals were forcibly relocated and then the growing population spread out in their new landscapes. So today I'm going to talk about the course of these migrations in 3 parts. First, when the Muskox were captured in Greenland for relocation to Scandinavia. Then the development of conflicts between those new residents and the already present human residents in Norway. And finally, the self-migration of Muskox to Sweden from Norway, which it borders. I'll begin then with part 1, moving unwilling Muskox. In 1899, the Swedish geologist Alfred Gabriel Nordhorst led an expedition to Greenland. And according to his book recording his adventures, Nordhorst observed wild muskox herds during the expedition and came to the conclusion that Swedes should try and import and domesticate the animals. The main purpose for this endeavor would be to corner the market on muskox wool, since it's considered one of the highest quality wools available. He believed that the muskox would acclimatize perfectly to Sweden and be even more productive than reindeer, which were herded already as semi-wild domesticates. Nordhorst was insistent on the worthiness of his cause. Quote, "They're not to be kept here as a curiosity, but are to be domesticated for the benefit of our descendants. One may seriously hope that the experiment will succeed." So the year after Nordhorst's adventure, the zoologist Gustav Kolthoff led another Swedish expedition to northeast Greenland to bring back specimens for the new biological museum in Stockholm and to capture live muskox. Now, while bringing back a live muskox to Sweden had sounded like a really straightforward idea, capturing muskox calves live was no easy task. A muskox has a prominent horn plate that spans its forehead and extends in forward-pointing horns on either side in both sexes. When threatened, a herd forms a circle like this one with calves in the middle. And from this position, a dominant adult will often charge a perceived threat at a shockingly fast speed with horns down like a charging bull. Kolthoff's expedition soon discovered that because of this, the calves could not easily be separated from the adults. The only way to catch the youngsters was to kill all the adults in the herd first. Kolthoff graphically recorded the expedition's attempts at capturing the calves, which included shooting all of the adults. In several cases, the slaughter resulted, in fact, in no calves caught at all. A long translated passage from Kolthoff is worth considering at this point, which I will read. "In the company of Ostergren, Levenskjell, and some of my most hardy men, I rowed them ashore, where we went around the animals and approached them, so that they found themselves between us and the sea. As soon as they became aware of us, they stood immediately in a protective ring, and the calves took their place among the elderly. So the magnificent animals lowered their heads, threatening to turn against us. But when we reached good shooting range, I asked Shell to shoot first. He hit a bull in the forehead who fell instantly. At that moment, I shot one, and a third went to Levin's shot. Now the other animals took to flight, but in that instant, a big bull got a bullet from my second gun, with the result that he drove his horns into the ground, did a somersault, and tumbled dead near the embankment down to the beach. Only 2 cows escaped in the company of the calves. I switched out the double paradox rifle and brought down one cow while Shell shot the other. The calves then stopped and became encircled by us, and I was sure to catch them. Then, unfortunately, one of the men became too eager, rushed at them, with the result that the already quite calm calves broke through our lines and fled to the mountains." This kind of violence and ripping apart of the muskox herds on East Greenland would continue for the next 69 years. Norwegian and Danish expeditions continued to shoot all the adult animals in a herd in order to extract the live calves. At least 290 live calves were brought to Norway between 1899 and 1869. Of the total, 70 were used in domestication projects, 75 were set free in the wild, and the rest were either sold to zoos or died before they could be sold. In addition, about 50 calves were taken out of East Greenland and shipped directly to other countries without going through Norway. Kolthoff justified the muskox slaughter in order to capture the live calves because of its future benefit to the Swedish nation. He said, quote, "Surely 2 muskox calves in Sweden are much more valuable than 6 in Greenland." So the place where muskoxen lived affected their value to humans. Acclimatized muskoxen directly benefited Sweden. They were worth more than free-roaming animals unused in Greenland. This was a forced migration in the name of nationalism, and it had a price for the animals. If they survived the slaughter, they were forcibly removed to distant lands and released into newly constructed herds of all young animals, a family situation radically different than what they had in the wild. Now, the reasons muskox were brought to Norway in the late 1920s are many. The practical reason was to establish a new meat-producing animal in the country. It's quite good meat, I will add. I've tasted muskox. Especially one that provided a meat resource for seal hunters on Svalbard, which was an Arctic island claimed by Norway at the time as a territory. In some publications, you also have the mention of this wool as a potential product. I'll note that neither of those ever happened in any large quantity. But on a political level, Adolf Hoel, who spearheaded the effort and was the head of the Norwegian Polar Institute, believed that the importation would help Norway's international reputation. You see, strong critiques of Norwegian seal and whale hunting practices on East Greenland had recently been raised, particularly coming from Denmark, which claimed the rest of Greenland. And one of the major complaints was that hunters were supposedly unnecessarily slaughtering muskoxen, leaving the carcasses either to rot or feeding perfectly good meat to sled dogs. And these practices were supposedly threatening the muskox with extinction in Greenland. A proposal was written by a group of Scandinavian scientists requesting that muskox be given protected status in East Greenland. So Hoel, in this context, wrote, quote, "There's no doubt that the transfer of this species to Svalbard is a measure that will improve international public opinion of our hunting practices. We will show with it that we not only murder, but that we too support international idealistic cultural work. The project has national importance for us, Norwegians." Within this nationalistic context, a total of 17 calves were released on the island of Svalbard, and 39 were set out in the mountains of Dovre in central Norway between 1929 and 1953. But not only were the muskox who were moved to Norway not asked if they wanted to come, but the local residents were not asked if they wanted muskoxen in their backyards. An author listed only as Nicolette published a poem in the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten only 2 weeks after the first release of calves in Dovre. In her 4-stanza poem, she says that she'd been a regular hiker in the Dovre Mountains, and one of the imminent dangers had always been that there were cattle bulls allowed to graze freely. But now she has, quote, "heard with a shock that the danger steadily increases. Now someone has let loose a flock of wild muskox. So with muskox in the front and muskox behind, there's a danger. Think," she writes, "about when a tourist comes carefully creeping and when all the bulls in the mountains come into rut." She decided she could no longer trek in the Dovre Mountains because the danger was too great. It was like a boxing match with that kind of muskox ruffian, she says. Now, the project leaders tried over and over again to downplay the danger of muskox. So, for example, the secondary headline of an Aftenposten article immediately after the release announcing it says, "They're not a danger for mountain hikers." So while muskox did threaten hunters on Greenland, particularly if the hunters had dogs, that was admitted, no one had ever been killed by one. So the conclusion was, quote, "Tourists have nothing to fear if they don't tease the animals." But in spite of statements to the contrary, muskoxen and Dovre did prove themselves to be dangerous on occasion. In 1954, on the left, a family going into the mountains to pick flowers saw a herd of muskox with calves and decided to approach them and take pictures. They got within 30 meters before one charged them. No one was injured, but the action photo of the muskox running towards the camera showed it must have been a pretty experience with your kids. In September 1963, a local man tried to take a photo of a muskox that made its way into a village. He supposedly got to about 15 meters before the animal charged. He was knocked down, but he was able to recover his camera and take a picture of the muskox standing below his two comrades up the tree. In all of these incidents, people had approached the muskox to either photograph it or observe it, often getting ridiculously close to them. Now, muskoxen are generally calm animals, but they attack when they feel threatened, which is what getting close to them does. These animals were not attacking people randomly. They were attacking people that they thought were attacking them. Consistently in the newspaper reports, authorities stressed that the muskox were not dangerous if people kept their distance. But the conflict culminated on Wednesday, 22nd July, 1964, when 74-year-old Ola Stollen noticed a muskox near his farm. He told 3 other adults about the visitor, and they wanted to observe the seldom seen animal close up, so they crept within 40 meters, stood still, observing the animal for about 10 minutes. After a while, the muskox began to snort and then charged the group. Ola was knocked down, whereas the 3 younger adults quickly ran back to the house. When he stood up, he grabbed a stone to try and scare away the animal. That was a bad move, because the muskox charged again, and this time gave Ola a life-ending blow to the chest. Witnesses called the sheriff, who contacted the regional muskox manager or wildlife manager of the area and asked if they could kill the bull. The manager said, oh, he'd come and take care of it, but before he got there, the local sheriff and another man had shot the animal dead. The local inhabitants were outraged at the death. They sent an ultimatum in a telegram to the Ministry of Agriculture, which had been involved in importing the muskox herd, saying that we're therefore bold enough to ask the ministry to make sure all muskox are removed from the valley. After this date, all muskox which are found in the said area will be shot. We hope and believe you will understand our reaction. Now, according to interviews in the papers, the deadline was picked because it was the first day of school, the 24th of August, 1964. Children were scared to walk the 3 to 4 kilometers through the forest to school, especially since in this part of Norway it would be dark both before and after school by the late fall. Women as well didn't want to leave their farms alone for fear of the muskox. The response of the local community of Engen to Ola Stollen's death was focused on the animal. No one from the local community said anything about the human behavior that had led to the incident. It was the muskox that needed to be removed. On 28th August, the Ministry of Agriculture issued an official response to the Oppdal sheriff in response to this threat to kill the muskox. They said, you can't do that. The muskox are legally protected as large wildlife according to the law, which means the animals cannot just be killed, but a license could be issued for to take down a specific muskox which was threatening people. So it had to be targeted kill. So the problem was that muskox were no longer supervised by anyone. The Norwegian Polar Institute, which with the Ministry of Agriculture had first imported the animals, disavowed responsibility for them in letters. And the ministry's position was that, quote, the state and the ministry have no special ownership of these animals, and they've not been able to find any basis in law which gives the ministry the right to issue hunting permits. So although the muskox conflicts continued to arise, especially when lone males showed up in towns or would-be photographers got too close in the mountains, there were no more generic outcries to extinguish the population in Dovre. Muskoxen had been originally translocated to Norway for economic and political usefulness, but by 1964 they had become naturalized. They were no longer scientific or agricultural objects. They were wildlife protected by the same big game restrictions as all other natural fauna, giving them certain rights. They had become a natural part of Norwegian nature. But soon they would move. On the 1st of September 1971, the regional Swedish newspaper Östersunds-Posten warned readers on their first page, "Wild muskox in Härjedalen, warning they can attack." A group of 5 muskox from the Dovre mountain region had been spotted near the Norwegian-Swedish border, and they appeared to be headed to pasture on the Swedish side. This cartoon shows the muskox running to those better pastures. He says, "Ah, cloudberries." The papers continued to cover each sighting or failure to sight the muskox over the next week. The local tourist industry in the area quickly grabbed onto the muskox as a potential draw. So already, only 2 days after the sighting, a tourist hotel was already advertising its first expedition to Muskoxenes land, so Muskoxen's land, to take place the next morning. A Norwegian tourist staying at the hotel scoffed at the offer. "It's Dovre, that's Muskox's land," he said. But Norway would no longer have sole claim over the animals. If the muskox did settle in Härjedalen in Sweden, they would be exploited to draw in tourists. Now, from the herd's perspective, there was no boundary to cross. There were no fences. There's no markers in the mountain that they would recognize that divide Norway and Sweden. The Swedish area they were headed for was ideal from their perspective as grazing grounds. So at the time of the crossing, the Directorate for Hunting, Wildlife Conservation and Freshwater Fish in Norway was responsible for monitoring the herd. And they decided there was no action to take to get the muskox to return to Dovre, since wildlife normally crossed the national boundaries, wildlife like reindeer. And thus, according to the head of the Directorate's Trondheim office, it was, quote, "standard practice that the government doesn't interfere in animals' natural migrations." The Swedish government did exactly the same thing, choosing not to act. So the animals stayed in the border mountains, actually migrating back and forth over the national boundaries every year. Now, from the perspective of many Swedes living in the area, this herd is Swedish. And they quickly became to be understood as a central element in the mountains. So when the Postal Service issued a stamp series in 1984, Sweden's Mountains, the images chosen included the angelical flowering plant, the lemming, and the muskox. The text, which accompanied the first day issue in both Swedish and English, tells of the rapid integration of the muskox in Sweden. They say, quote, "In 1971, the muskox came back to the Swedish fauna. The occasion can be seen as a return to the fold, and today there are some 30 animals in the province of Härjedalen." So this human inclusion of muskox in the Swedish fauna came only 13 years after the herd had immigrated over the border of their own account. Now, although the herd size boomed in the 1980s from only 5 individuals to 30, there was even talk about relocating sub-herds to other areas of Sweden to populate the whole thing with muskox. The population crashed in the late 1980s. And some locals, as well as the Swedish Green Party, wanted national action to boost the muskox population. A parliamentary motion was filed in 1990 by 4 Green Party members requesting an investigation into potential ways to help the muskox, arguing that because paleoarchaeological finds of muskox had been made in Sweden, quote, "the species belongs truly to Sweden's original inhabitants. We have no right to abandon the muskox." But the official response on the other side to that motion in 1991 claimed that while the animal had value to the tourism sector, they recognized people might go and spend money to go see the muskox, quote, "muskoxen have been extinct for such a long time in Scandinavia that they can no longer be seen as part of our natural fauna." So this tension between those who saw the muskox as a natural part of the national fauna and those who didn't continued unresolved. There was a parliamentary motion again in the year 2000, so 10 years later, as well as actually a draft threatened species action plan for the muskox. They were all denied. So the muskox doesn't have a conservation plan in force in Sweden. It's not recognized as eligible for listing as an endangered species because it's classified as introduced. Although people didn't introduce it, it introduced itself. Yet a local handling plan established in 2002 did include some short and long-term actions to increase the muskox population. And that plan had suggested potential translocations and setting up a breeding center. And that's in fact what has happened. There is a muskox breeding center in Härjedalen, and the first release of a captive-born muskox into the wild herd this past spring 2013. So as a final comment in these three parts, I want to offer some thoughts about how these short histories of muskox in Norway and Sweden reveal a tension between animals as individuals and animals as species when they're on the move. The muskox migration happens on an individual level. Muskox calves are forcibly taken from their herds. A lone muskox attacks a human. A small herd of muskox migrate to Sweden. But at the same time, humans, we primarily talk about migrant muskoxen on a species level. So we want calves to start new economic production. We label all resident muskox as potential transgressors. The Swedish state takes up the question as to whether or not it's truly a Swedish animal. So not unlike human migrations, which happen through the choices of individuals, but are often instead categorized as groups or races. I mean, we can think about news reports which cover the migration of North Africans to Europe, or the migration of Roma to Sweden, which has been in the news, as if the membership in the group erases individuality. The same thing happens here, that the muskox becomes labeled as a race, a species, which can be legislated and discussed in the abstract without the individuals. The movement of individual muskox to Scandinavia has been rife with contention. Yet in all of these challenges, then, the muskox as a species has actually entered Scandinavian culture. As a race, it's been granted naturalized status within the cultural realm, if not the legal one. In the Dovre Mountains of Norway and the Härjedalen area of Sweden, muskox sternly look out from signs, brochures, and posters. You get likenesses of muskox as paperweights and children's toys and fire starters. You can buy really expensive muskox wool knitted hats and mittens and sweaters. So while the muskox has proved culturally to be integratable, the biologists who list the threatened and endangered species of Norway and Sweden have classified the muskox as a foreign resident. It doesn't belong. It's not worthy of protection. And the biological viability of the species remains unclear with the numbers that have been imported. So only time will tell if the muskox is a permanent resident of the region and whether or not these immigrants will ever become full citizens of Nordic nature. Thank you.